Consider this scenario. You're walking down the street at night when a person dressed as a clown appears out of nowhere and begins sprinting towards you. Obviously, you'll have an emotional response. But what is it? Perhaps we say, I am afraid. Maybe you say, I'll start running. Or you may add, I completely freeze up and start sweating. You see, our emotions are complex. We feel those feelings not just in our heads, but also in our bodies. Emotions can drive intentional or involuntary activities, and psychologists have spent many years attempting to understand how our minds and bodies perceive various emotions. There have been numerous hypotheses proposed to explain the function of arousal, cognition, and behavior. However, all have since been disproven and replaced by newer theories. The James Lange hypothesis of human emotion was the first in modern psychology, and it focused on the body's physical arousal. It was later supplanted by the Cannon-Bard theory, which proposed that emotions originated in the intellect rather than the body. These hypotheses did not satisfy many cognitive psychologists, including Stanley Schachter and Schachter Singer. This prompted the development of the Schachter Singer theory of emotion, generally known as the two-factor theory of emotion. So let's look at what these two distinct components are, how they interact, and how this theory fits into cognitive and social psychology. So first and foremost, what is the two-factor theory of emotion? The two-factor theory of emotion acknowledges that cognition and arousal both contribute to emotional identity and feelings. Emotion is not solely the result of bodily sensations or mental thinking. Both of these processes influence the feelings we experience and express to others. Context, previous experiences, and an individual's understanding of their own body can all influence how they identify or experience emotions. So let's dive into the two components. Schachter and Singer argued that humans felt emotions when they were aroused and had context or cues to assist them identify and categorize these emotions. The process began with arousal. So the first one is bodily. Arousal is defined in psychology as a state of alertness to the point of perception, and while it plays a role in sexual sensations, it is also vital in fight or flight consciousness, as well as just paying attention. When a person experiences stimuli that elicit specific emotions, they initially feel physiological arousal. This arousal occurs in the sympathetic nervous system. Maybe your palms sweat, your chest tightens, or your hands and feet go numb. The second aspect is mental. When a person sees this arousal, they must use external indicators to figure out what is going on. This prompts them to identify their emotions. Appraisal is a cognitive process. When confronted with a potentially dangerous stimuli, humans engage in one or more rounds of assessment. First, a person will undergo primary appraisal. Their thinking wonders, is this stimulus a threat? In the example I gave at the start of this video, you'd probably conclude that a bizarre clown running at you is a threat. Secondary appraisal is the next step. The body then asks the mind, how do I handle this threat? Frequently, the answer is either fight, flight, or freeze. You may find yourself hitting the clown, fleeing, or freezing in dread. However, cognition does not cease here. If you learn new knowledge that alters your perception of the issue, you may need to reappraise it. For example, perhaps the clown calls out your name. You can then recognize your best friend's voice. Now this idiot does not appear to be such a menace. It's just your pal pulling a prank on you. Your palms may be sweaty and your pulse may still be racing, but you now recognize your experience as relief rather than dread. Schachter and Singer then conducted an experiment to test their beliefs regarding these processes. Participants were injected with epinephrine. It's a hormone that causes a rise in heart rate and a few other negative effects, but these individuals were aware of what to expect. However, not all of them did. The subjects were then placed in a room with a confederate, who acted either euphorically or furiously toward them. Participants who were aware of the side effects reported no significant changes in their moods, whereas those who were unaware of the side effects were far more likely to report mood changes. So individuals in the room with the euphoric confederate were more likely to name their emotions as euphoria, whereas those in the room with the furious confederate were more likely to label their emotions as anger. This demonstrated that both physical arousal and contextual cues influence a person's ability to perceive and identify emotions. So this theory assumes that people are aware of their emotions and that when they experience those emotions, a bodily response occurs within their bodies. When you first have a panic attack, for example, you may be unable to pinpoint what is going on inside your body. These new feelings, such as your chest constricting or your hands tingling, may seem perplexing to you, but they are still occurring regardless of whether you can recognize them. A study of guys on a bridge aimed to invalidate the two-factor theory of emotion. The participants were encouraged to go across two separate bridges, one narrower and scarier than the other, and at the conclusion of each bridge, a woman handed the men a questionnaire and instructed them to phone her with any questions or comments. Interestingly, the researchers discovered that men who walked across the terrifying bridge were considerably more inclined to call the woman and tell her stories with sexual content. So you may be wondering why they did this. The researchers believe that when the men walked across the terrifying bridge, their bodies reacted in some way. And then the men used cognitive processes to infer that their arousal was caused by their sexual attraction to the woman rather than the bridge. This is known as the misattribution of arousal. So one could argue that the guys identified their emotions inaccurately, but only because their physiological arousal and cognitive interpretations occurred in distinct processes. This study appears to provide evidence for the two-factor theory of emotion. Finally, because the two-factor theory of emotion is relatively new in the field of psychology, I want to address some criticisms of it. It was initially launched in 1962, and not all replications of Schachter and Singer's original experiments have yielded identical results. While there may be more to explain about the mental and physical processes involved in distinguishing emotions, Schachter and Singer's approach brings us closer than some of the previous simpler theories. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this video on the two-factor theory of emotion, and more importantly, that you learned something. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below and watch some of the previous videos in my series. Thank you for watching.